Thank you very much. So I will call this council workshop to order. This meeting is to be held entirely virtually. It's June 14th at 7 o'clock. My name is Mike Little, Mayor for the District of North Vancouver, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to this workshop of council. First, we have a resolution that's been submitted through the package, and it says resolution to hold the public meeting without the public in attendance. Looking for a member of council to move that motion.
So moved.
By Councillor Back, second by Councillor Kern. Call the question on the matter. All those in favor? Contrary minded? Motion carries. Next item we have is just the agenda itself. Council, an agenda has been circulated. Are there any errors or omissions from the agenda as presented? Hearing none, will someone move adoption of the agenda? Moved by Councillor Back. Is there a seconder on the motion? Second by Councillor Kern. Call the question. All those in favor? Contrary minded? The motion carries and the agenda is now adopted. And we do have one set of minutes that have been circulated. This is for the May 3rd Council Workshop meeting, and wondering, are there any errors or omissions from those minutes? Hearing none, will someone move adoption of the May 3rd minutes? Moved by Councillor Back, seconded by me. I'll second. Call the question on the motion. All those in favor? Contrary minded? Motion carries and the meeting minutes are now adopted. Okay, moving on to the purpose of tonight's meeting, which is the report from Councillor Staff, item 3.1, the Strategic Facilities Planning Framework. Mr. Stewart, any opening comments, or straight to Ms. Guppy? Mr. Ono, I see your hand.
Your Worship, this is simply trying to get some buy-in on the principles on which we'll assess replacement of facilities, with the opportunity for, of course, future councils to, make decisions and intervene. This is really just to create the startup process so that we can continue the work that we're doing on the long-term financial plan.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Ono, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, so as Mr. Stewart said, this is a piece of work that's being started by staff a couple of years ago based on the direction that Council had provided earlier about looking forward regarding asset management. And so, of course, facilities has a big part of the asset management portfolio of the district. And as Mr. Stewart mentioned, through the 10-year financial plan process, we know that there is about a $200 million gap that we now need to work to close. And we do know that we have roughly $345 million worth of facility work through our asset management work that we've identified that needs to be taken care of over this next 10-year window. And so on the one hand, that could be a liability. On the other hand, it actually presents a significant opportunity for this council, because there's been this convergence of community renewal opportunities related to the future community plans, and the opportunity to renew these facilities is in coordination with that. So the principles that you'll be seeing this evening are regarding the potential to have buildings in good condition, put into the right locations so they're effective for providing good services or great services to the community. They can be renewed with high energy efficiency and mitigate and reduce GHG emissions at the same time. And with that, we can then work through the financial plan process to make sure that all of this is affordable for the community of the District of North Vancouver. So all of this, Your Worship, is a very forward-looking piece of work. These principles can help us swing, I think, the entire facilities portfolio in the order of tens of millions of dollars. So significant swings in the financial plan in order to achieve the goals that this council would like to achieve, Your Worship. And with that, I have Mr. Stephen Carney with me. He's the acting section manager of facilities, and presenting tonight will be Tamsin Guppy with Matt Schofield here in support. With that, I'll hand it over to Tamsin, Your Worship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Guppy.
Thank you. And I'll start sharing my screen. And so I just click to this. Can everybody see it okay? It should say the strategic framework for facilities.
It's not up yet.
Okay, let me just click again. Nope. Okay, give me a second. Let me just slide that over. Nope. Back here.
There we go. That looks like it's working.
Good. Sorry
Fantastic.
about that. Let's go back to the beginning. Here we go. So thank you very much for this opportunity tonight. It's going to be a short presentation. And once again, my name is Tamsin. I'm with the facilities team, planner with the district for a long time, but it's an exciting opportunity to look at our district buildings that are really often the hearts of our communities and think about where we want them to be in the future and how we can make them work even better. So it's quite an exciting project. This is going to be a short presentation, really just focusing on principles that will then help frame the actions we take in the future. So once again, this is feeding into that work that was started by Rick and the finance team back in January on the long-term financial plan, where we're trying to look ahead and think about what we will need to do in terms of asset renewal and in terms of day-to-day operations. So the financial plan looks at all of our assets, including our streets, our sewers, and so on, but a big chunk of those assets are our buildings. And so today we're just looking at the buildings piece and how that feeds in. So thinking about our buildings, we have approximately 100 buildings in the facilities portfolio, and they range in age. And this graph is showing how many buildings were built in each decade. So we had 7 built in the 1950s and so on. And intuitively, we know that older buildings are more likely to need to be replaced, partly because at a certain point, buildings start to show the signs of wear and tear, and partly because our community has changed over time. Where we need services to be is changing. What we need those services to do is changing. We've grown a lot since the 1950s, and technology has changed a lot. But also, when you think about a public building, there is an expectation that it's safe, that it's open to everyone. So when you recognize that seismic requirements didn't come in until the 70s and accessible requirements didn't come in until the 80s, you can get some indication right off that some of our older buildings aren't going to meet the needs that we have for them today. The other thing I wanted to point out right from the get-go is that facilities doesn't come up with the projects. Those nuggets of ideas about what we need in terms of buildings to serve our community come from the teams that are providing those services, whether that's the library strategic plan shown on the left, the parks and open space strategic plan shown here, North Shore Emergency Management's plan, the Child Care Action Plan, the Fire and Rescue Services Plan, and other plans like NVRC's strategic plan. These are the plans that Council has endorsed that set our targets for the future. And those teams then work together to think about what they will need to best provide their services. But those nuggets of ideas are then overlaid with our more general plans, the district's broad goals and objectives. So shown here, we have the Community Energy and Emissions Plan, which is our climate action plan, helping us chart the way forward to move our buildings from fossil fuel heating systems to electric heating system to be more energy efficient. We also have the climate change and adaptation strategy, which is thinking about how we might need to deal more with things like heat events and storm events and the resiliency issues we will need to face, how we'll need to deal with sea level rise and what those impacts will be on our buildings. Of course, our official community plan, and in other places you'll see I also reference the work that's currently ongoing on the targeted review. And in both of those, we're looking at our town centers and our needs for the community and where we focus efforts. Last fall, Council endorsed the Inclusive Communities Direction, and that, of course, has huge implications for the form our buildings take. And then lastly shown here is our transportation plan as we try to reduce overall trips and put facilities where people can easily access them. These things all feed into how we build buildings and where we locate buildings. So the strategic facilities planning framework is a set of principles that firstly ensures projects reflect the district goals and objectives that have just been shown, and secondly provides tools that reduce the total costs of building ownership. So taking us into the principles themselves, our vision. We want buildings or district facilities that support the district's goals and objectives and will provide safe and inclusive spaces in a sustainable manner. So our first principle in this regard is that we implement all those goals and objectives I've just been listing as endorsed by council. And it doesn't mean we do it all at once, but as we think about each project, again, the different teams bring forward the idea. We look at how we can best meet that team's needs while thinking about our broader objectives. So trying to pull those all together in a planning document. The second principle is thinking about where we locate facilities. And by the way, when I show these plans along the bottom, it's a reminder that this principle is enacting the principles that are outlined in our OCP, in North Shore Emergency Management's resiliency recommendations, in our climate goals, in our transportation goals. Because when we put services where people can access them easily, especially in places like our town centers, we reduce overall trips. We put services where our most diverse mix of residents are. So we're moving towards putting services where they're easy to get to, where they're inclusive, where we don't have to drive to get there, where we may be able to catch the bus instead. So those are also getting at our GHG reduction and our traffic reduction issues. And in terms of North Shore Emergency Management, they're also getting at a resiliency goal, because if something ever should happen, we may not be able to drive long distances. And so to be able to walk to somewhere that can provide services and information is all the more important. Principle number 3, consolidate uses into shared buildings or sites. So the idea here, and many of you are familiar with the new Delbrook Community Recreation Center, and some of you will also remember that it replaced both the old Delbrook Community Center and the old William Griffin Center. And those two centers combined in one meant that we have one facility now that's more vibrant, more cost effective, more energy efficient than heating two distinct buildings. And by putting those uses together in one site, we've now freed up a site that is now available for affordable housing and park uses. So a very efficient way of thinking about things we need to do. So as we look ahead and think about buildings that need to be replaced or new buildings that may be required, we can look at where we can pull services together so we build fewer buildings overall. Principle number 4, optimize energy efficiency and reduce GHG emissions, achieving zero emissions well in advance of the 2050 target. So that's the target that's set in our community energy and emissions plan, but we want to do even better. And with our buildings, we have an opportunity to do that. And it's technology that's known. It's often very simple things like turning off lights and having the ability to turn off power when we don't need it. And by that, I mean things like heating on weekends and things like that. The picture here is a heat capturing system where we're sucking the heat out of the ice at one of our ice rinks to then heat the building. So there are things we can do in this way that either through refurbishments or when we're building new will help us meet our climate targets. Principle number 5, invest in building maintenance, refurbishment, to extend the life cycle of buildings and improve the economic, environmental, and social sustainability of facilities. Now, some of you will have remembered this little graph, and it's really just saying, as a building ages, It goes from being in perfect condition when it's brand new, and then over time in less and less good condition until it actually fails and is torn down. But if we maintain these buildings, then they will last longer. And if we occasionally invest in them in major refurbishments, then we can extend the life cycle of those buildings. And some of those investments are about functional requirements, things like improving the inclusivity and accessibility of a building, improving how the building functions. If you think about things like the story lab that libraries did at Lynn Valley Library, that was a functional change that helps make the library more relevant in 2020 or 2021 as we now are. One of the upcoming projects we have in this regard is renovations to one of our fire halls that still has a good chunk of life left in it, but isn't working as well as it needs to in terms of the safety of our firefighters, in terms of the privacy and inclusivity, recognizing our changing workforce, and in terms of energy efficiency. So by thinking about our refurbishments, we can extend the life of our buildings and make sure our buildings do what they need to do. Principle number 6, plan for the closure of buildings reaching the end of their useful life. And this is often the most difficult because our buildings are loved. Great things happen in our buildings. People have birthday parties in them. People have meet friends in them. They're really well loved. But at some point, even the most loved thing reaches the end of its life, and we have to start making decisions about it. And if we recognize that and plan for it, then we can stop investing in a facility and spend our money wisely. So this is about recognizing when the time is right to close a building. And we only do that when we've looked at the building and we know that even if we were to invest heavily in refurbishment, we still wouldn't have a building that functions the way we need it to do. So it's a combination of things that pushes a building to a point where it's on the list of buildings to close. Principle number 7, plan ahead. Well, I'm a planner. I love this principle. So this is about thinking long term. By applying these principles and assessing our buildings, we can come up with a list of buildings that have actions associated with them. It doesn't mean that we take all of those actions right away, but if we know what's coming, we can look for opportunities to save money, to make more vibrant facilities, to build better. So to give you a few examples, we talked about Delbrook already, where that's a consolidating of 2 facilities. Opening later this year, shown in the middle image here, will be the Lionsgate Community Recreation Center, and that was a partnership with the developer, so a CAC project. But we were able to take advantage of that opportunity because we had 20 years of thinking about what we needed in Lower Capilano and had been unable to build until that point. So this was a chance to both have a building built for us, but also get land for that building. Jerry Brewer Building down in the city is a partnership with the city and is not only a win in terms of savings where we share that building, but it's also a win for us in the district because it's built in the city, so we didn't even have to chip in land for that. So a double win for us. There are different ways we can look, and again, knowing ahead what's coming, we can grab opportunities for grants, potentially leverage land and find partners that way. And I think in coming years, we'll be looking more and more at how user fees may not pay for a facility, but may offset the cost of that facility. And remember, a lot of this is about looking at all of the different costs and where we can chip away at those costs to bring them in line with the money that we're already setting aside for asset renewal. So looking ahead, future council decisions will shape the list of proposed projects and the timing for future projects. And remember, when we started and I was talking about each of the team's strategic plans, those are endorsed by council. Those are where council says, yes, firefighters, or fire and rescue services, that's the direction we want. That's the level of service we want for our community. And it's those decisions that then help inform what's coming down the pipe. The timing is also a council decision, because though we can generate as staff a list of potential projects, every time we look at an annual budget, we have the opportunity, or council has the opportunity, to defer certain items and prioritize others based on the needs of that particular year and the budget constraints of that particular year. As an example, last year with COVID, we put some projects on hold and instead switched a lot of our staff energy and facilities on things like plexiglass and separation and making sure our centers were safe to operate. So we can change depending on what happens. So by applying the strategic facilities framework, we can ensure we implement the district's goals and objectives, and we can overall look at how to reduce the total costs of building ownership. But again, this is only part of the conversation. It continues, and in the fall, finance will be coming back with the financial planning work, looking at tools to close the funding gap, which will include some of the things we discussed today, but a whole lot of other tools too that are more around how we think about managing money and managing assets. Again, thinking about what feeds into the need for buildings, one of the questions that will be discussed by council in coming months will be the childcare piece. Community planning brought forward the childcare action plan, but the next set of work will be looking at what that means for buildings and what our role is in providing space for childcare in the years to come. And again, each year as council looks at each budget, there'll be decisions to be made on which projects get pushed forward at that time and which ones are delayed. Our recommendation this evening is that these principles in the strategic framework for facilities are endorsed or approved by council. And that really ends my presentation, but of course I'm here to answer any questions that may come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Guppy, for your presentation. Okay, I have Councillor Curran first.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. So this is coming back from an earlier workshop, and I appreciate that the principles will evolve based on the policies that the council has adopted at any given time. And I don't know that we have all the right policies in place to build upon yet, but I think it's something that we're actively working on. So just some, last time I spoke about biophilic design as a principle, and I do recognize that that's probably an area that council, community, and staff probably doesn't read about all the time like I do. So that's an area to understand. But I think that design principle is really, really critical for 21st century buildings. It just goes so far beyond what we perceive as built form today. They're buildings that actually create their own energy. They function as close to nature as possible. And I think in a community that is surrounded by and has such a deep love for nature, that would be a really important principle. The buildings have lots of, Mayor Little will like this, lots of economic benefits to the community in terms of the cost to manage them over time. There's lots of co-benefits in terms of health impacts. Right now, people don't understand how many red listed chemicals go into standard building design. So the Living Building Standard, which is the North Star in my view right now of buildings, the architect who designed it said, I'm not interested in buildings that are less likely to cause cancer. I'm interested in buildings that can't cause cancer. So for public facilities, I think there's just such an opportunity to leapfrog what people see. Hawaii, New Zealand, other places have adopted this standard for public buildings and for school buildings. And so they're buildings that are actually doing what we've relied on nature to do for a long time. Every bit of pipe and everything we build is to take care of something that nature was taking care of before we built on top of it. And also that cultural grounding, rooted in place, being able to partner with Indigenous partners, Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish and Musqueam, to bring in some cultural pieces into those buildings, and other folks who celebrate their cultures, because these are, to me, the heart, as you said, Tamsin, when you opened your presentation. So I don't think there's any type of building that I'm more excited about than a public building that can be built to these new standards, and just challenging some of the language around sustainable to perhaps regenerative. Sustainable to me sort of says that we're at a point where we just need to sustain, and I think we're actually at a point where we need to regenerate. And the idea of being able to incorporate more green space, both indoor and outdoor, into all these facilities, I think is so critical as we potentially encounter future pandemics. Having more outdoor space that's covered, how that could work in these spaces, I think would be an important consideration. And then just the idea of thinking at the end, at the beginning. So, you know, when we're all gone, many generations from now have to deal with the decisions that we make today. Have we made the best decisions that we could in terms of how do these products potentially become circular and get to be used to create the next round of buildings? So I think that life cycle assessment is very important, both in terms of measuring embodied carbon, but also looking at all the materials that go into these spaces. And there's proof now over and over again, as more folks adopt these more progressive standards, that it can be done at a cost competitive rate, and the co-benefits for health are so substantial that they just can't be denied. So both mental health and physical health. I love the slide that you had of the fire hall with housing on it. So just that idea of these things that we hadn't previously thought of, using the spaces as flexibly.
Oh no. Okay. Councillor Curran, we've lost you, and but that's okay. We'll come back to you. Next up, I have Councillor Bond.
Thank you, Mayor Llewellyn. Thank you, Tamsin, for the presentation. I always like when you give a presentation, because you bring all these complex concepts and all these kind of very high level plans and weave them together so well. And I think that this strategic facilities framework and the 7 principles mentioned do that at that high level too. I think it's often easy to overlook all of the planning and the ongoing work that has been going on for years and for decades, for all the different very specific plans and general plans that go into the decision, and all that background information, all the background study and public consultation that is done with all these plans to, inform something as concrete as, where do we put this public facility? Do we replace this public facility, or do we refurbish it? There's so much work over so long that goes into those decisions, and I think this is a really important set of work that you and staff have been working on. So I appreciate that. I want to concur with a lot of the comments that Councillor Curran mentioned, and we're going to get the sunset in my window here in just a second. About the design of the buildings and the other important things that she mentioned about the longevity and inclusivity. The one thing I think that you mentioned in the presentation, well, is that these buildings, these public buildings, will be and are the hearts of so many different places in our community. And the more that we can do following these principles to bring more of those things together, so that people can access more services and feel comfortable and safe, and have the ability to access so many more of the benefits, the public benefits, in one location, or at least in close proximity. I think those lead to a lot of the other outcomes that we're looking for in terms of reduced transportation, better health outcomes, and better public life. The one, I think I'm often by Sealand Park, the new Sealand Park, and I see how many people are using that new facility for all kinds of different purposes that were never possible before. And then I think that with that new community recreation center opening up relatively soon, how the interaction of that public space, the inside and the outside space, and all the different services are just going to bring so much benefit to everyone that comes into that area, and both the residents that live close by and those that are those that visit or come there for other purposes. So very supportive of these 7 principles. I think at the high level, it's everything kind of leads us in the right direction for making important decisions. The one thing I'm wondering is we had a conversation at the Major Projects Infrastructure Committee, and I'm wondering if, as part of the development of this framework or the rollout of this framework, if staff had considered going out to the different committees of council that we have that represent the different project areas or those individual plans, and presenting this framework for feedback. I think each of those committees has a very broad and unique set of expertise on the different areas that they represent, and might be able to provide some valuable feedback to staff in implementing kind of the high level framework, and to make sure that we've got the 7 principles, that we're not missing any principles, or if any of these principles need to be refined. I think there's a good opportunity for feedback from the members of our various committees.
I think it's a great suggestion, Councillor Bond. Yeah, thank you. Councillor Back.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. And thank you, Ms. Guppy, for the presentation. And I know we've had a chance to talk about this previously. I agree with all the comments that my colleagues have made so far. I mean, I think if, one thing we've learned over the last year and a half is we look at public spaces a little bit differently, and we value them even more than ever. And I think, this document, this strategy will really force us to look differently at what these new facilities look like. And even some of the more traditional, what sound like a traditional facility like a library are doing so much more now. And so I really appreciate how you've pulled together the needs of all of our various partners. And I think this will really challenge future councils and staff to look at buildings differently. So I'm excited by it, and I certainly agree with all of the 7 principles that are laid out. And I think they really do pull together everything that we need in terms of looking at new facilities. So thank you very much, because I know these kinds of things don't happen quickly. This was a ton of work, I'm sure. So thanks very much for all of staff's work on this.
Thank you very much, Councillor Back. Councillor Murray.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, this is the beginning of discussions in regards to how we're going to be replacing existing buildings and looking at future assets in the community. I think it is a really good suggestion, and one I was going to offer myself in regards to reaching out to a lot of our committees that have expertise in and maybe different perspectives in how they would look at how we're moving on a specific projects or how we can improve. I know when we built Parkgate, I don't know, how old is Parkgate? 20, it's 25 years, because I remember I was on council when we decided to go ahead with that building, and that was to replace the community center down in Deep Cove. The theater was put into the Cove on Gallant. There was a community hall where the Lions exist today, and Parkgate came about. And Parkgate was created, the district sort of had a perspective about the building, and then through, we had a community school at Sea Cove, and we had a wing at Sea Cove that was dedicated to the school district to use as a community sort of hub. And that organization, Seymour Community Services Society, was what it was called at the time. They worked with the district to bring the community together. And I remember we had it in the gym at Sea Cove, and we sort of had a brainstorming session about, what we wanted to see in the building. And it's a great facility. It's a great building. And then as we moved forward and we looked at Delbrook, you always want to learn, from other buildings. Parkgate, unfortunately, I guess the kids don't mind it, but the acoustics in that massive gym that we built are the worst. And it was hard to have sort of theater nights or big band nights because the sound echoed so horribly because of the high ceilings and all the metal. You know, I think we realized later that the multi-purpose rooms could have been bigger because they were so popular, the programming that was going into those multi-purpose rooms. We learned a lot, and I don't know if we've actually fixed the problem because it was challenging when we were looking at Delbrook. But access into the facility through sort of one entrance to deal with, you know, people coming in from multiple access points, like Harry Jerome deals with people using multiple doors to get into the facility. And then you have an issue of security, but also, you know, pass holders and a paying at the front door. We don't want to think that that happens, but it does. So there's always a lot to learn from the past and how we move forward into the future, how the buildings are used. I know with the fire rescue hall, and I was just trying to find it on our website, but I couldn't. What was the lifespan of this building, the Maplewood Fire and Rescue Center? Do we know?
Yeah, mine
Was it
says,
650 or 60 years?
yeah, I mean, it's in that order.
Yeah.
It's a bit tricky. Like, you plan for a building of about 50 years, and structurally you want it to last that long, but you don't necessarily need it to last much longer. And this sounds odd, but because often by the time it's that old, the community it's serving is changed so much that it may not be doing what it needs to do anymore. And it may, in which case then you invest in refurbishments instead. But as a rule of thumb, when you're thinking about buildings as assets, you kind of use the 45 to 55 year range as what you expect it to be. And there may be some things where we can plan for longer because they really are less likely to change. Some of our park washrooms are getting really old now, and they haven't changed that much, right? But they are now reaching a point where they're either too small, you know, things. So even something as simple as that can get to a point where it doesn't serve its use. And if you think
I think that's a way of thinking that maybe we want to have a discussion about, because if you were to suggest those timelines to any area in the rest of the world, Asia, Europe, South America, they would just look at you and go, or, you know, I mean, you're kidding, right? Like, you know, my stepdad's house in England, in Suffolk, the new part is 300 years old. You know, the old part is closer to 5, the downstairs. Mind you, you can see from the top floor down to the bottom floor in some parts of the house. But it stood for 500 years, the building that he lives in. And, you know, with the technology that we have, with what we've learned from the past, with what we know now about the places where we're building these buildings, I mean, 45, 50, 60 years is just, I mean, we talk about on our Heritage Committee properties that are well over 100 years old and how we want to save them. And they're probably built better than most of the stuff that's been built in the last 40, 50 years. You know, I've used examples of a house we owned. When we opened up a wall, we found yellow cedar. I hate to admit that, but that's the kind of, you know, structures that they were building then, and using whole logs. Now we know what withstands earthquakes, what withstands fire, what withstands flooding. We're building them in areas where I hope we're getting it right. But I can't believe that we are only building these buildings for 45, 50 years, only to turn around and have to refurbish or replace. It just seems like such a short period of time. And I really think we have to look out to 100 years. You know, why don't we want a fire and rescue building in Maplewood in 100 years, unless of course it's under the ocean, which theoretically it could very well be. But I think the 45 to 50 years doesn't work. The example or the suggestion that Councillor Bond was going to bring up was again one that I was going to suggest as well. And I say that because I know from the North Shore Emergency Management, the discussions that were coming out of the states in regards to emergency management is, you know, don't build buildings that you're going to be using for triaging or community meeting places during an emergency that are built with glass. And Delbrook is one of those buildings that we identified as a building to, you know, act as that sort of central hub if that earthquake comes, when we have that big emergency, and, you know, the vast majority of the walls are glass. So it's things like that. And I think the reaching out to our different committees, I think are going to prove very helpful in reckoning with some of these areas. And the final thing I'll say is that we always have to be very cognizant that there's only one taxpayer. And these buildings that we are replacing, they are, you know, there's obviously, you know, funds that are put aside for them, although we never completely, you know, have the money available to replace the scope at which we are looking when these new buildings come forward. I think we had, what did we have in the bank account for Delbrook? I think we had 27 million, and it came in at 47 or something like that. I can't hear you, Mayor Little. Anyway, it was, we needed some money to add on to that building. So it's never a one-to-one. But there is only one taxpayer, and we're certainly, there's a list of amenities that we're receiving based on the development that's being considered and approved and looked at for the municipality. And all of those amenities that we're taking on, they are going to become depreciating assets on our books too, and they will need to be replaced. And so cumulatively, and let's not even talk about what Metro's building, because the infrastructure that's coming out of Metro Vancouver for the region is, you know, it's an astonishing amount of money, you know, from the collective perspective of the municipalities that make up Metro Vancouver. Those are big numbers for us. We're a small city still, and those are big numbers. So those cumulative totals that are coming, we really need to understand that. Now, there's parts of the region where we're changing a lot. The gap between rich and poor is getting wider almost daily. And, you know, who knows what the future holds for our communities. But I think we always have to make sure that we're looking at the totals and not operating in silos. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Murray. Councillor Back.
Just a brief point, because it was pretty well covered in Councillor Murray's comments, but I agree with looking at the lifespan of the building. And if you are talking about 50 years, making sure that we are building out in a building that we've got room to grow in. In the case of a rec center like Delbrook, I think it was underbuilt. I mean, the fact that it's full of a variety of user groups pretty much at any given time, you know, pre-COVID, of course, but I think when you look in the city of North Vancouver, they might be making the same mistake there at Harry Jerome, but it's just making sure that we are looking far enough out to be able to grow in these facilities that are going to be there for a very long time. So I do agree with many of the comments that Councillor Murray made with regards to that, and making sure that, you know, we are looking way ahead.
Mr. Stewart.
Yeah, just beware, Council. You're going to have sticker shock. If you want to plan for 100-year buildings as opposed to 50-year-old buildings.
Fair point.
And Tamsin's really correct. I mean, in a fast-changing world, the needs for these buildings and the uses of these buildings are going to be very different. And so what we need to do is be building buildings that can transform themselves during their lifespan, but at the same time manage the integrity so that you know, we're getting good value out of the construction.
Yeah, and I also don't want to give the impression that that William Griffin is not built to exceed 50 years. Sorry, Delbrook is not built to exceed 50 years. It is built to a very different standard than the stuff that was produced in the early 70s, and there's no reason that it couldn't be minor reconstruction or minor changes when you get to the end of life, rather than total loss situation with many of the structures that were built before we understood the higher standards of seismic impacts and also HVAC systems and everything else like that.
My comment was just with regards to the size and capacity of it. I think that it could serve, it could be bigger, but I certainly think the building is built to the standards that are going to make it last well beyond 50 years. I wasn't alluding to that in my comments at all.
Yeah, and so again, to Mr. Stewart's point, build flexibility in, right? So that we can change it as the community needs change. I remember specifically Ron Andrews at Delbrook, actually, volleyball was the big game in the 1980s and 70s, and they started changing it to these closed racket ball courts that you could use for volleyball. And over time it changed, the demand changed, and so you find a suitable reuse for the space. But you're absolutely right. If you underbuild the facility, you also lose a lot of that flexibility. Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't have all that much to add. I certainly agree with the 7 principles conceptually, and I thank you very much for the time and obvious care that was put into preparing that conceptual framework. I'm aware at the same time that the conceptual framework, the principles that are set out, are going to become much more real, I suppose, or much more tangible as we look at specific projects and we look at our specific plans for the replacement of the facilities we have. Very interesting that so many of our facilities, approximately a third, according to your report, are due for replacement within the next 10 years. And that's, of course, because of a strategy that was adopted, or a building standard that was adopted. I would put my voice forward as one that would suggest perhaps we should be building for more than 50 years and thinking about how to repurpose our buildings and looking for strategies that don't rely on what are essentially planned obsolescence of these types of amenities. But my overarching comment would be, thank you so much for the principles, but I look forward to the more specific discussion with respect to our program for replacement of the projects, replacement of the facilities and the different projects that we're going to be initiating, and the difficult decisions that are going to have to be made about prioritization. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Hanson. Councillor Curran.
Thanks. Sorry, I lost y'all for a second. Just had full computer crash. I can't remember everything I covered, but I'm sure I thought of new things. But thinking forward to how we're going to keep our community safe and healthy in a changing climate, things like clean air shelters and places to go when you need relief from smoke, recognizing that people will be impacted differently by those events. But I think those are really important co-benefits of spaces. I just wanted to get back to the idea of why I think it's so important for us to lead in this space and to be among leaders in this space is because of the power that municipalities have to procure at a local level and to shift systems through what they're able to do just at a local government level collectively. So as Vancouver adopts green roofs and we adopt green roofs and we start building differently, it builds the industry capacity for that. And I just want to push back on the inevitable argument that is always like we have to pick if buildings should be built sustainably or regeneratively, as I think is probably a more appropriate term, or most cost effectively. And I think that there's so much evidence to really dispel that myth that you have to pick one. You don't. And I think we have to just push past that status quo narrative that I hear repeatedly, but then gets put in practice in multitude of cases that shows that it's just not true. And so some of the other things that really came up for me, the universal accessibility, I really appreciated that. And that's something that's shifted culturally over time, right? As far as bathrooms being accessible for any gender or not, non-binary. And the other thing is just that intergenerational social connection, I think is so important to have spaces that appeal to all different age groups. And I think we've done largely a great job of that, seeing ceramics happening and other things happening in a space, I think is really special. So that merging of art and sport and culture, I think, is so critical. And I guess I just wanted to read, because I don't think I'm going to, this is one of the frustrations, is we're probably not going to get to amend these principles. I mean, largely I agree with them, but I do think that biophilic design standard council will have to tell me what I need to do to make that a principle. I'll be working behind the scenes on that because I think it's so critical. But just close with this quote that says, we now know about integrative design, about regenerative design, where you're not trying to do a green building, but a building that heals the ecosystem and the social system that you're dropping it into. It turns it away from being the object and into a relationship. So I think we largely don't put enough thought into the spaces that we spend 90% of our lives in buildings, 90%. So let's be really careful about the materials that go into them, and really connect the community back to nature, which I think is so critical. And I'm really excited about that. There are so many buildings that we have an opportunity to influence in this next decade. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Kern. Councillor Murray.
I just wanted to add a couple of things just in the comments in regards to don't underbuild, and certainly we underbuilt the parking at Delbrook. That's one thing that we did that backfired, and I don't think we really considered the draw that building was going to have from sort of a North Shore regional perspective. I often see a number of councillors from West Vancouver at that in that weight room. So the underbuilding, but do we again have to look at these buildings in a different way? And I know that we talked about it with the rec center in Lower Capilano, and actually Capilano Community Services Society, when they were faced with that building, taking as long as it did to be realized, they looked at, and I think Mayor Little, you were on council at that time, when they decided to just be mobile and go out into the community, mobile library and mobile services going out into neighborhoods, and they didn't need a building. We've got one now, but is it always about a structure? Is it more about a service? And does it make more sense that we go into, I mean, again, Mayor Little, you'll remember these conversation about satellite RCMP. Sorry, remind me again.
Community policing. The
community policing, where once we sort of had them centralized, but then we talked about sort of moving them out into the neighborhoods. We talked about Lower Lynn and Lower Capilano having walls that move, so you can open up those spaces when you need bigger spaces and close them when you need smaller spaces. Instead of locking ourselves in to this, we have to have this many rooms for administration, this many rooms for multi-purpose, this for large, like we're so programmed to think that way. And, COVID has taught us deprogram. We can do things differently. Can you imagine some of the things that we have experienced in the last year? If we had said that 6 months before COVID, it'd be like, oh, we're never going to do that. No, we can't do that. We're not allowed to have those meetings like that. We can't be, we can't be meeting online on Zoom. Yes, we can, because we had to. We were forced to, so we did it. So sometimes I think lots of times I think we're our own worst enemy. So buildings that are multi-use, that can change with generations and change every 10 years, are just about good design and being simple. Can you imagine if I was just thinking about solar, because I don't understand why we don't have solar panels on every single one of our roofs. I just do not get it. Which made me remember that Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House 40 years ago. He did that. Little Jimmy Carter did that, and then Ronald Reagan took them down in 1986. Like, can you imagine if we had put solar panels on the roof of the Municipal Hall, on the new OC, on the library in Lynn Valley, on Delbrook? Like, can you imagine where we'd be? you know, those dollars would look differently, the ones that we're using. Why not? I think so often we want to get this perfect system. We want the platinum model, and we're afraid to take risks because it's not perfect. And I think we need to take more risks. I think this last year was just a big, huge risk. And so many people tried so many things. Our business community became, you know, as they are, very creative in figuring out how they needed to do things. We put tables in the middle of roads. We conducted business when people were on Vancouver Island and they were running engineering services for the North Vancouver's Rec Commission. We had people at home that don't live in this municipality running our operation. Like, you know, we can do all sorts of things. We just have to be, you know, think outside the box and take some risks and chances and just do it because it's common sense and it sounds like a good idea. So often I think we implement ideas that we think are going to work and then they don't. And we learn from that. So I hope going forward, you know, I know we're trying to use buildings in a different way in Townsend. That's come through with both your presentations, but I think it has to be a bit more than that. And we need to build simple buildings that last longer, that respect the one taxpayer that's paying for them, that will take us into the future, like so many buildings from the past. So many buildings. We have a lot of good information from the past that will teach us how we move into the future.
Thank you, Councillor Murray. I'll take a slightly different angle on some of that. I mean, the challenge is with the risky side of things is that we've been burnt on some in the past. And so it's always about managing the risk and the exposure in some of those facilities. So as an example, with the Lynn Valley Library, which was only completed in, I think, 2006, you know, we went for a built green standard on the facility that ended up with an HVAC unit that was nowhere near what the facility needed to have an open corridor between all the floors in the middle. And so there was a disconnect between the principle and the priority to make it an environmentally sound building and also just the practical design of the facility. And there was a disconnect there. And so we ended up in a situation where when you get up to the third floor, you've got people with individual air conditioning units at their desks and individual fans, and then also in the wintertime, individual heaters. And so we intended to do something on the principle, but because it wasn't considered throughout the whole structure and it wasn't considered in the design of the building entirely, we ended up in a situation where we actually were worse. Where we were spending extra dollars to make it comfortable for the people who had to work in that space.
It's probably not the best example, Mayor Little, and you will agree because you have some background on that I do too. And the Lynn Valley Library is far from the best example to use in regards to your perspective. But I hear you. But
just saying,
it had a lot of issues and it wasn't, you know.
That's right.
We've come a long way.
Absolutely. And with each building, it will get better, I'm sure. But we had similar problems at the Parkgate Library as well, where the HVAC unit had a ton of challenges keeping it for the building as well. So we have to make sure that the risk is balanced and that when we see those kinds of risks, that the entire building is reconsidered to make sure that it's going to work. I think that the public building of the future is multi-use on a level that we have not contemplated in the past. This is where you've got everything in it. Now, when we talk about the new rec center at the bottom of Cap Road, it's going to have library in, it's going to have rec in, it's going to have all of our service representatives, it's going to have museum and archives, rotating displays at the facility. Every unit, every public facility will be multi-use to the nth because we're trying to get those services to every corner of the municipality. We had a long period of time where that western portion of the district was extremely poorly serviced with public amenities that were actually quite adequately delivered in Lynn Valley, Lower Lynn, and Seymour. And so So we had to look at how we could build a new facility, but also make it as multi-use as possible to draw in all of these other services into the area. We're also going to have to reconsider what needs to be brick and mortar in the future and how it needs to be delivered. I know we've got about 300,000 titles in at our libraries, but I got to say, 20 years from now, if the trend continues, over half of our circulation from the libraries is already digital. About 1.2 million in circulation a year, and over half is digital. And so when we look at what libraries look at in 20 years' time, either we're going to have to be doing, as Ms. Guppy mentioned, with the digital literacy program and the digital lab, we're either contemplating new services coming in, or we're repurposing some of that space to other community amenity, whether it is an extension of the museum and archives, as I mentioned. And so we always have to be open to that. And I get that there's always going to be an inertia in the community where people are used to going to that space. That's their beloved space, and it's a challenge to change that. I also want to put our mind to storage. And I know it's the unsexiest thing in the district system completely. Nobody wants to talk about building a beautiful building for storage. But we desperately need a 300-bed field hospital in the North Shore. There are things that we are right now, we are reliant on other municipalities across a bridge in another area to be able to serve our community in an emergency. And so when we look at our public buildings, we have to consider how this can be used as a space, as an emergency response center, and making sure that we are self-sufficient and resilient as a disaster resilient community. And that is going to require us intentionally building, at a very great cost in some cases, storage in our facilities. And so I just want to put that out there, that's another challenge. And the other piece is, I know I don't want to get into direct competition with a lot of the private fitness centers and such, but you see the private fitness centers all moving to 24-hour operations. But those fitness centers tend to be in neighborhoods where we've built multi-use, where we've put single-family, where we put multifamily built in with that. And so you see the inherent conflict along Marine Drive when you have a 24-hour fitness place go in and you've got residents over top. Well, the rec centers don't tend to have residents in and around them. They tend to have fitness centers. And so, is there a way to partner up and make it so that the overnight hours of that particular club are accommodated in the overnight hours at a rec center, or some other kind of way to make it so that there's a less impact? I'm just saying that people have very different lives now than they had 40 years ago. They're going and pursuing fitness at great cost at all hours of the day, some trying to get in and get their fitness workout before the workday begins. And we don't currently accommodate that. And we leave that to the private sector, which is fine. It's just, it may be an area under stress, particularly as lots of those locations are tied in with multifamily use. So I'm optimistic that we have a bright future with very functional, useful public facilities in our community. I think my hat is off to, to the finance team. 2004, the district started setting aside 1% for capital replacement in the District of North Vancouver. That was a very forward-looking policy. And what it does is when we're making that critical decision that Councillor Curran talked about between whether a building is just rebuilt as is or whether we go for something at a higher standard, we're doing it with the vast majority of the capital set aside and ready to go. And so it's a lot easier to make those leaps once you have already saved up the money to be able to build a top flight first tier public facility. My hat is off to the finance team for putting us in that position, and to the council for continuing to support that, because I think it's going to be critically important to us continuing these services to our growing community. That's all my comments on the matter. I've got Councillor Curran up another time.
Just a quick question. I know we don't pass motions typically at workshops, but I just wonder, it seems like I've tried to find some solutions that support council initiatives, and I'm just wondering if we could, if there's support for staff to direct back on what a biophilic approach to our specific municipal buildings would be, because I have brought that up before and it hasn't moved forward. So just taking every top opportunity I can get in this climate and ecological emergency to advance policy that aligns with science. So who's coming with me, team?
I think goal number one does accommodate for the changing priorities of the council, and I think that that's so there is a catch-all of if the district decides, if the council changes their mind, or we can always amend the principles as well as we go forward. But we're not going to amend them at the workshop necessarily. But I think Ms. Guppy, I don't know if you have any other comments on that.
I think I think there's a couple things going on. Yes, we do have that catch-all. As policies change, this will reflect those changes. But I think also when we think about the I think it's policy number 4 on climate action, this could be something that feeds into that as well. The focus was primarily on fuel switching and energy reduction, but how we build buildings that are energy efficient is the big question, right? And different buildings will be tackling this in different ways, but that is an opportunity to consider biophilic design. Not every building is going to be perfect for any particular building system out there. A park washroom may be very different in how we build it because of how clean it needs to be and how easy to clean it needs to be. But some of those principles that come from that body of work around thinking about the life cycle of our buildings, thinking about how the quality of air we breathe in the buildings, those are things that we try to embed in all of the work we do. But it doesn't hurt to perhaps add a line about that. And I'm happy to kind of think about how to tweak that, or we can tweak it going forward if we end up more formally adopting a policy specific to biophilic design. Essentially, I'm in your hands. But even just by raising it, I think we're all going to be more aware of it going forward.
Mr. Stewart?
Your worship, I'm going to sound like a dinosaur right now, but I don't understand what biophilic design is. But certainly I think
that's why staff needs to do a report.
So, but I do think staff understands that, and I do think the sense of principles that we put out accommodate the possibility of it. Let's put it that way. So I would just encourage council to support the recommendation of staff, because I certainly think that they can accommodate all of the interests, varying interests, as we go forward.
Thank you. Mr. Ono, did you have further comment? Your hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I was just going to say we'll certainly take it under advisement from Councillor Curran's suggestion, and we will do some work. And I think Tamsin's already nodded her head and said that we could do that. So thank you very much, Your Worship, for the direction.
Thank you. Okay, I see no further speakers from council. We typically, at the tail end of a council workshop, see if members of the public are interested in adding to the conversation. Hang on, sorry about that. Hang on. And so I see Mr. Teven and I see Mr. Colbert, and that's it at this point. Mr. Teven, you've got 3 minutes to address council. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Your Worship and Council. It's an interesting topic and obviously important to every one of us citizens. And you know, when I think about the principles that I would like to see applied as a citizen, and I pay much attention to the presentation that talked about the great efficiency at the shared facility, the Jerry Brewer building, it makes me think of our public schools. And you take the example of Inter River and Lynn Creek. In Inter River, on the north side of the freeway, we have an elementary school that's aging. In Lynn Creek, to the south of the highway, we have a brand new rec center getting built. And so the people from Lynn Creek who need to use the school will have to travel. The people who from Inter River who want to use a rec center will have to travel. Yet a school and a rec center have gymnasiums, sports fields, multi-purpose rooms all in common. I would like to see more dispersed, maybe smaller footprint, but more increased number of multi-purpose facilities where during the hours of 8:30 to 3, the gymnasium is reserved for the school. From 5 a.m. until 8:30 a.m., from 3:30 p.m. until 10 p.m., midnight, whatever it is, it's available for the rec center. If you really want to have walkable neighborhoods, do you really think in the middle of winter in a rainstorm, mom and dad are going to schlep their kids by foot from the new rental place on Oxford Street all the way north across the highway to take their kids to school? They're not. They're going to get in a car. And if that's really a goal, then I think that a lot more partnered facilities between the Rec Commission and the school district would probably make a lot of sense. So that's all that this makes me think of. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Teevan. Mr. Colbert, you had your hand up, but it's down now. Just double checking. Did you have a comment? Okay, I don't hear from Mr. Colbert. Anyone else wishing to address the workshop? Okay, well, thank you very much to everybody for participating.
Council, can you hear me?
Oh, there you are, Hazen. Yes, I can hear you.
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here. I had to unplug your jack. Mayor Little and Council, as I've listened to everything tonight, and it's all been extremely good, and I only have to commend Council and staff for some really excellent input tonight. What I want to say from my own experience, however, is if we truly want to green and be efficient, not just in the District of North Vancouver, but also across the Lower Mainland, the best way to do it is to amalgamate our 22 municipalities into one, so that we only have one city hall, not 22. That we reduce the number of public buildings that we have substantively. For instance, why do we have a plan to rebuild the Harry Jerome Center, which is not even 2 kilometers away from a world-class building that we have in Delborough? That does not make sense for 2 small municipalities. And I'm only using the 2 small municipalities of the DNV and the CNV. What if we take all these municipalities in the Lower Mainland and we put them together? We can eliminate an extraordinary amount of duplicate and redundant buildings. That's what I'm asking Council to think about. If you are genuinely in support of these things, the way we do it, number one, is at the municipal level, we amalgamate. And I thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Colbert. Okay, I see no further speakers on the matter. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for, oh wait, sorry. The report actually asked for Council to make an endorsement, and I want to be clear, this keeps coming up. Maybe it's just that it's in the form, the boilerplate that we use for producing the reports. But as was mentioned, we don't typically make decisions at the workshops themselves. We do officially do them at a regular meeting of Council. But if you want an endorsement for us to refer this matter to a regular meeting of Council for decision, I'm all for that. Mr. Stewart?
Your Worship, what we try to do is get direction from Council so that we can format it into a framework that we can actually deal with in Council. So it is really important in principle the Council endorses this, and of course, then the recommendations will come back in the form of specific decisions on facilities as part of the long-range capital plan. So I know it's a little unusual, but these are a set of principles. They're not a binding set of principles, but they give staff an opportunity to actually create a framework as we come back to Council with recommendations around a capital plan over the next 10 years.
Okay, so you want us to endorse the strategic facilities planning framework, but and have it referred back to a council meeting for just further discussion? Because
No, I'm suggesting, Your Worship, that if we endorse the framework tonight, it will allow us to come back to council in the next discussions with respect to a long-term capital plan. It just allows us to apply them. It gives us some way to move forward. If council doesn't accept these, then I don't know where we are.
yeah, I just want to be clear, Mr. Clerk. We typically are not properly convened for regular council type business in a workshop. Just want to be clear that you're okay with what Mr. Stewart has proposed, that it's just getting a council endorsement of these principles, but that the actual changes in policy would occur at a regular meeting of council.
Actually, Your Worship, we structure workshops as special meetings of council. We say they're workshops and they're informal, and that works well for council. But in reality, structured behind the scenes, these are a special meeting of council. Council is in full capacity to make resolutions that are binding. We try not to make that front and center because it takes away from the informality of the discussions that go on. However, if a resolution is to be made, it will have some legal standing.
And that's the problem. It's not a regular meeting of council, and a decision is being made that will effectively tie the hands of the District of North Vancouver. That's my only concern, Mr. Stewart. That's not normally how we...
Okay, I hate to disagree with the clerk, but I will. I don't find any resolution in a council of the whole is binding. And the fact of the matter is, in this particular case especially, we will have to now then take those principles, apply them to the long list of information and projects that we identified earlier for council, and then come back. So there will be many iterations on this, not only for this council, but the next council. So I don't consider this to be binding, but it's particularly helpful because if we don't have anything, what you have is the staff recommendations. And that's not always acceptable to council. So I really do, urge council to support these particular principles and realize that we will have lots more discussions with council as to how we apply them. And almost in some cases, when we look at annual capital budgets, building by building.
So I'm going to move that the council endorse the strategic facilities planning framework and principle and refer the matter to a regular meeting of council. Is there a seconder on the motion?
I'm happy to second.
Second by Councillor Hanson. I have speakers on the item, Councillors Bond and Forbes. Councillor Bond.
Yeah, just one comment. I would, as I suggested, and Councillor Murray was also going to suggest, I would like to get some more feedback. This is, there is a lot of work behind this, but it is a relatively short report to council in the workshop format and a bit of a verbal discussion. So I think just before we kind of set anything in stone to say is probably the wrong way to say it, but to take this out to the various committees to get some feedback, and then whether it comes back as a formal council resolution in a regular meeting or it comes back as an information report, I would like to have a little bit more feedback on these principles especially from our committees. So if that motion, endorsing this in principle and getting that feedback and then incorporating that feedback into a formal motion at a regular council meeting for endorsement, it fills that purpose, then I'd be happy with that.
And again, I think that's a great suggestion. I'd be supportive of that. Before it comes back to council, that we have an opportunity to share it with particularly the Recreation Commission, the library, and the Museum and Archives, the boards that operate facilities for the district.
Emergency management is a really good one too.
And the CMO as well. Yeah.
Because we're going to use these buildings multi-purposely for emergencies going into the future. So.
I think that's a great suggestion, and I'm supportive of that. Councillor Forbes.
My comment was going to be similar to what Councillor Bond just made, except that besides the committees, I would like to see that the public gets an opportunity in here. they're the ones that are going to be the taxpayers on anything that we do. And so I think I agree with how you're doing it, Mayor, that we could be in favor. But I think that it needs to, I'm not comfortable with decisions being made at workshops. Just because we have the right to do it doesn't mean we necessarily should. And I would prefer that they be made at a public council meeting, whether it's virtual or we eventually get in person. So that's my comment, that I would prefer that this be done at a proper regular council meeting, not at a workshop, as far as final acceptance or anything like that. And that allows the public to say something as well.
Thank you, Councillor Forbes. Councillor Curran?
Yeah, I think Council's made good points about the committees needing to review this as well and having opportunities for the public. So I definitely support that. I'll just say there's not any principles that are not agreeable. Like, I think we all agree with the principles. I think we think that the principles, it's going to be, the proof is going to be in what we actually deliver. And there's still opportunities for staff to report back. So I would like to see the principles eventually be more robust and inclusive of all this feedback. But I don't think there's anything in there that is not something that we generally, it sounds like, in this group support. But yeah, I'm fine with it coming back to a public meeting as well after feedback.
Thank you.
Your Worship, staff would be happy with just adding the words "in principle" after the word "approved." Would more than achieve what we need to achieve tonight, which is to say there's a general agreement. Now we need to do more consultation on that.
And so what I've moved is "in principle" and that the matter be returned to a regular meeting of council. Mr. Stewart, is that's?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Second.
Councillor Back, did you have a further comment? Oh, you're muted.
I was just going to say I'm in agreement with all the comments I think that have been made around the table. I think we all do agree on the priorities, but I'm in favor of just taking one extra step. I do think it's important, as you highlighted, that our partner agencies are given the opportunity to provide some input. So I'm in favor of what's being proposed.
Thank you, Councillor Back. Mr. Clerk, you had a comment?
Oh, no, Your Worship, I was just going to confirm the resolution we have as you stated.
Okay. And I believe it's been seconded. I see no further speakers, so I'm going to call the question on the motion. All those in favor? Contrary minded? Motion carries. Okay, thank you very much, Council. Thank you to members of the public for participating in our workshop here today, and look forward to further public engagement on this matter, as well as getting more feedback from the committees that volunteer in the community. I think that's a good step on this project. At this point, we have concluded the business of the workshop, and so I will accept adjournment.
So moved.
Accepted. Moved by Councillor Back and accepted. Thank you all so much for your participation. Have a great evening. Members of council will be reconvening the earlier meeting.